In de diepste krochten van zijn privé-dagboeken, ver weg van de censuur van academische kringen en maatschappelijke verwachtingen, schreef Carl Jung observaties over de vrouwelijke psyche die zo radicaal, zo onthullend en zo controversieel waren dat ze decennialang verborgen bleven voor de buitenwereld. Wat hij ontdekte in zijn jarenlange studie van vrouwen, als patiënten, als collega's, als muzes en als complexe menselijke wezens, daagde niet alleen de conventies van zijn tijd uit, maar onthult waarheden over de vrouwelijke natuur die zelfs vandaag de dag zelden worden uitgesproken. Jung schreef in zijn dagboek: de vrouw bezit een wijsheid die de man nooit zal begrijpen, omdat ze geboren is uit een mysterie dat dieper gaat dan alle rationele kennis. Maar zijn observaties gingen veel verder dan romantische idealisering. Hij zag in de vrouwelijke psyche een complexiteit die zowel fascinerend als angstaanjagend was. Een kracht die zowel scheppend als vernietigend kon zijn. Een diepte die zowel helend als gevaarlijk kon zijn. Hij begreep dat de vrouw niet de zwakkere geslacht was, zoals zijn tijdgenoten beweerden, maar iets veel krachtiger en primitiever. Een directe verbinding met de oerkrachten van het leven zelf. Denk aan die vrouw in je leven die je tegelijkertijd aantrekt en intimideert. Misschien je moeder die met één blik kon laten zien wat je voelde voordat je het zelf wist. Die ex-partner die je emotionele wereld volledig op zijn kop kon zetten met een enkele opmerking, of die vrouwelijke collega wiens intuïtie altijd raak, leek te zijn ook al kon ze niet verklaren waarom. Jung ontdekte dat dit geen toeval was. Vrouwen, schreef hij, opereren vanuit een vorm van bewustzijn die fundamenteel verschilt van die van mannen. Een bewustzijn dat meer verbonden is met de onderstroom van het leven, met de subtiele patronen van emotie en betekenis die onder de oppervlakte van de dagelijkse realiteit stromen. Dit was zijn eerste brutale waarheid. De vrouwelijke psyche is niet een variatie op de mannelijke psyche, zoals de psychologie van zijn tijd beweerde. Het is een volledig andere manier van zijn in de wereld. Een manier die dichter staat bij wat Jung het collectief onbewuste noemde, die directe toegang heeft tot wijsheid die buiten rationeel begrip ligt. Vrouwen, observeerde hij, zijn natuurlijke shamanen, geboren mediums tussen de zichtbare en onzichtbare werelden, tussen het bewuste en onbewuste, tussen het individuele en het universele. Maar deze verbinding met diepere krachten kwam met een prijs die Jung als tragisch beschouwde. In een wereld die werd gedomineerd door mannelijke rationaliteit en controle, werden vrouwen gedwongen hun natuurlijke gaven te onderdrukken, te verstoppen of te vervormen om te passen in structuren die niet voor hen waren ontworpen. Het resultaat, schreef Jung, was een epidemie van vrouwelijke neurose, depressie en een vervreemding van hun eigen essential nature dat hij beschouwde als een van de grootste tragedies van de moderne beschaving. In zijn meest persoonlijke dagboekaantekeningen schreef Jung over wat hij beschouwde als de fundamentele crisis van de moderne vrouw. De complete loskoppeling van haar cyclische, intuïtieve, emotionele natuur van een wereld die alleen lineaire, rationele, emotioneel gecontroleerde manieren van zijn waardeerde. Hij observeerde vrouw na vrouw in zijn praktijk die leed onder wat hij de ziekte van de ontkoppelde vrouwelijkheid noemde. Een toestand waarin ze vervreemd waren van hun eigen diepste natuur en probeerden te functioneren volgens mannelijke paradigma's die nooit voor hen waren bedoeld. Jung noteerde: de moderne vrouw probeert een man te zijn en daardoor verliest ze toegang tot de krachten die haar zouden maken tot iets veel krachtiger dan welke man ook. Hij zag hoe vrouwen hun natuurlijke intuïtie probeerden te onderdrukken om rationeler te lijken, hoe ze hun emotionele diepte probeerden te beperken om professioneler over te komen, hoe ze hun cyclische natuur probeerden te negeren om lineair productief te zijn zoals van mannen werd verwacht. Het resultaat was wat hij beschreef als een psychische mutilatie die niet alleen de individuele vrouw schadde, maar de hele samenleving beroofde van essentiële kwaliteiten die alleen de vrouwelijke psyche kon bijdragen. Ik denk aan een vrouw die me vertelde over haar carrière in de corporate wereld, waar ze had geleerd haar emoties volledig te onderdrukken, haar intuïtieve inzichten te wantrouwen ten gunste van data en logica, en haar natuurlijke neiging tot cyclisch werken te forceren in een constant lineair ritme. Ze was succesvol volgens alle externe maatstaven, maar van binnen voelde ze zich dood, alsof een essentieel deel van haar was afgesneden. Toen ze eindelijk begon te begrijpen wat Jung bedoelde met de vrouwelijke natuur, realiseerde ze zich dat haar depressie en angst niet tekenen van zwakte waren, maar signalen van een psyche die schreeuwde om reconnectie met haar own authentic nature. Jung observeerde dat deze loskoppeling zich manifesteerde in verschillende symptomen die hij zag als specifiek vrouwelijk: een constante twijfel aan haar eigen waarnemingen en gevoelens, een neiging om de meningen van anderen boven haar eigen innerlijke knowing te plaatsen, een verlies van verbinding met haar lichamelijke cycli en natuurlijke ritmes, en een vervreemding van wat hij haar instinctive wisdom noemde. Vrouwen, schreef hij, werden ziek van het proberen rationaal te zijn in plaats van wiese te zijn, van het proberen consistent te zijn in plaats van authentiek cyclisch te zijn, van het proberen emotioneel gecontroleerd te zijn in plaats van emotioneel alive te zijn. Maar Jungs diagnose ging nog dieper. Hij begreep dat deze loskoppeling niet alleen psychologisch was, maar spiritual. De vrouw, schreef hij, is van nature verbonden met wat hij de Great Mother noemde, de archetypal force van leven, dood, rebirth, intuition en transformation. Wanneer ze wordt losgekoppeld van deze connection, verliest ze niet alleen haar psychische vitaliteit, maar ook haar spiritual purpose. Ze wordt, in Jungs woorden, een schaduw van haar own cosmic significance. Deze diagnose was brutaal, omdat het niet alleen individual vrouwen beschuldigde van het verraden van hun natuur, maar de hele moderne civilization van het systematisch onderdrukken van feminine wisdom. Jung zag dit als een van de root causes van wat hij beschouwde als de spiritual crisis van de modern world. Een world dat zo out of balance was naar de masculine side dat het threatening was zijn own destruction. De meest controversiële passages in Jungs dagboeken gingen over wat hij beschouwde als de dark feminine, de aspecten van vrouwelijke natuur die de most modern people, including vrouwen themselves, preferred to deny of suppress. Hij schreef over de destructive power van vrouwelijke rage, de manipulative potential van feminine intuition, de consuming nature van maternal possessiveness en de terrifying depth van feminine sexuality wanneer het fully unleashed werd. Deze observaties waren zo challenging dat veel van zijn female followers hem ervan beschuldigden misogynistic te zijn, terwijl hij argued dat hij simply the completed truth over feminine nature probeerde te understand. Jungs exploration van de feminine shadow begon met zijn observation van hoe vrouwen dealt met anger, terwijl mannen, schreef hij, typically expressed rage directly en physically vrouwen developed what hij called indirect aggression, een vorm van attack dat much more subtle maar often much more destructive was. Hij observed hoe een vrouw could destroy a man's self-confidence with a single perfectly aimed comment, hoe zij could manipulate entire social dynamics through emotional pressure, hoe zij could use it withholding van affection of approval as a weapon that left deeper wounds than physical violence. A man told me eens over zijn divorce, waar hij slowly began to realize that zijn wife had been systematically undermining zijn confidence for years through what seemed like innocent comments about zijn appearance, zijn career, zijn friends. What had seemed like caring concerns, I gradually understood, had been subtle forms van psychological warfare designed to make him dependent on her approval and too insecure to leave her. Jung would have recognized this as een manifestation van what I called it devouring mother archetype. D. Feminine tendency to control through emotional manipulation when more direct forms van power are not available. But Jung was careful to note that these destructive tendencies were not inherently evil, maar often the result van feminine power being forced underground by societies that refused to acknowledge it directly. When vrouwen were denied legitimate channels for their natural authority and influence, they often resorted to what I called shadow tactics, indirect ways van getting hun needs, met dat weer often more damaging than direct confrontation would have been. I also observed the consuming nature van feminine love when it became possessive. While masculine possessiveness, I noted, typically focused on ownership and control, feminine possessiveness was more subtle but potentially more total. Een possessive moeder, I wrote, could devour her child's soul while believing herself to be perfectly loving, creating een dependency so complete that the child never learned to trust, hun own instincts of make hun own decisions. An possessive lover could create what I called golden cages, relationships that felt loving but were actually forms van psychological imprisonment. Perhaps most controversially, Jung wrote about what I saw as the terrifying power van fully expressed feminine sexuality. I argued that most people, including women themselves, had no idea van the true depth and intensity van feminine sexual nature because it had been so thoroughly repressed by civilization. When this nature was fully awakened, I observed, it could be overwhelming not only for mannen, but for the women themselves. I wrote about patients who had experienced what I called sexual mystical experiences that were so intense they felt like forms van possession by archetypal forces beyond human control. These observations about the dark feminine were brutal because they challenged both masculine assumptions about feminine weakness and feminist assumptions about feminine innocence. Jung insisted that where empowerment for women required embracing hun complete nature, not just the nurturing, intuitive, gentle aspects that were socially acceptable, but also the fierce, destructive, consuming aspects that were vaak denied of projected onto others. In zijn most mystical writings, verborgen deep in his private journals, Jung described what I experienced as direct communication with what I called the eternal feminine, an archetypal presence that spoke to him through symbols, synchronicities, and what I could only describe as inner visions. Deze experiences were so profound and so personal that I rarely discussed them publicly, fearing that they would undermine zijn scientific credibility. But they formed the basis for zijn most revolutionary insights about the role van the feminine in human consciousness and spiritual evolution. Jung wrote, "Zij speaks not in words, but in images, not in logic, but in poetry, not in sequence, but in wholeness. To understand her, language, one must abandon her masculine need to categorize and control, and instead learn to receive what zij offers like rainfall on parched earth." I described Dee's feminine voice as ancient beyond measure, carrying wisdom that predated all human civilization, connected to natural cycles that were older than human consciousness itself. Dee's communication manifested in what Jung called symbolic thinking, and form van consciousness that understood meaning through metaphor, story, and archetypal imagery rather than through logical analysis. I observed that women were naturally more fluent in this symbolic language, which was why they often seemed to understand emotional and spiritual truths that men struggled to grasp rationally. Een vrouw might say, "I feel like winter is coming," and convey a complex emotional state that would take a man paragraphs van explanation to approach. Ik remember a woman telling me about whose I always knew when sommige was wrong in her family, not through any logical reasoning, but through what zij could only describe as a feeling in her bones. Zij would wake up in the middle of the night knowing that her adult daughter was in trouble, of zou suddenly become anxious at work and discover later that her elderly moeder had fallen. Jung would have recognized this as een manifestation van what I called participation mystique, and direct energetic connection that transcended normal boundaries van space and time. Deze symbolic consciousness also manifested in what Jung observed as feminine ability to hold paradox and contradiction without needing to resolve them. While masculine consciousness, Hij noted, typically needed to choose between opposites, good, bad, right, wrong, rational, emotional, feminine consciousness could contain contradictions and find wisdom in hun tension. In woman could love and hate the same person simultaneously, could feel deep grief and profound joy at the same time, could hold both hope and despair about the same, a situation without experiencing this as inconsistency, but as fullness van experience. Jung believed that this symbolic consciousness was crucial for what Hij called the healing van the modern world. Hij saw the extreme rationalization van modern life as a form van spiritual illness that was destroying humanity's connection tot natural wisdom, tot emotional truth, tot spiritual meaning. The feminine capacity for symbolic thinking, Hij argued, was not a primitive relic, but an advanced form van consciousness that could integrate rational knowledge with intuitive wisdom, could find meaning in suffering, could navigate complexity without losing touch with wholeness. But Dee's capacity came with what Jung considered both een gift and een curse. Women with highly developed symbolic consciousness often felt alienated in an world that valued only literal thinking. They struggled to communicate hun insights in ways that others could understand. They often felt crazy of overwhelmed by the constant influx van symbolic meaning that others couldn't perceive. Jung wrote about numerous female patients who had been diagnosed with mental illness simply because they were operating from N-level van consciousness that their society couldn't recognize of value. In what hij privately considered zijn most important discovery about gender, Jung wrote about what hij called the sovereign feminine, een state van consciousness that a woman could achieve when zij fully owned her own power, zonder needing to compete with or imitate masculine models van authority. This was radically different from either traditional feminine submission of modern feminist attempts to succeed in masculine-defined fields. The sovereign feminine, according to Jung, was something entirely unique, an archetypal embodiment van power that was specifically and authentically feminine. Jung observed that women who achieved this sovereignty typically went through what he called the death van de pleasing woman, an often painful process wherein they stopped trying to make everyone else comfortable with hun presence and instead began to own hun true nature, regardless van how others responded. This process, Hyde noted, was often triggering for both men and women who had become comfortable with feminine energy being contained, predictable, and non-threatening. Ian Woman in Therapy told me about the profound shift that occurred when zij stopped apologizing for hun opinions, stopped minimizing hun accomplishments, and stopped contorting themselves to fit into others' expectations van hoe zij should behave. At first, zij said, people reacted with shock and sometimes anger at this change. But gradually, zij began to attract different types van people and opportunities, ones that could appreciate and benefit from hun authentic power, rather than requiring hun diminishment. The sovereign feminine, according to Jung's observations, manifested certain distinct characteristics. These women trusted hun own perceptions above. Social consensus. They operated from hun own internal authority, rather than seeking external validation. They could hold space for others' emotions without feeling responsible for fixing them. They could express hun needs and boundaries clearly, without aggression but also without apology. They combined fierce independence with deep capacity for connection. They were comfortable with hun own complexity and contradictions. Most importantly, Jung observed, the sovereign feminine did not try to suppress or transcend hun feminine nature, but instead fully embodied it. These women embraced hun emotional nature without being dominated by it. They trusted hun intuition without abandoning critical thinking. They honored hun cyclical nature without using it as an excuse for inconsistency. They celebrated hun sexuality without being defined by it. They expressed hun nurturing capacity without becoming martyrs to it. Jung wrote, when een woman claims her sovereignty, zij becomes een force van nature. Unpredictable not because zij is chaotic, but because zij is authentically free. Zij cannot be controlled, manipulated, or reduced to fulfill others' needs. Yet paradoxically, this makes her much more capable than genuine love in service. I observed that men often felt both attracted and threatened by sovereign women, while other women often felt both inspired and intimidated. The development van feminine sovereignty, Jung noted, was not just personally liberating, but socially essential. I believed that the crisis van modern civilization required an integration van authentic feminine wisdom and power, not feminine energy that had been domesticated to serve masculine agendas. The sovereign feminine could contribute perspectives and solutions that were impossible from purely masculine approaches to leadership, creativity, and problem-solving. But Jung also warned that the path to sovereignty was often lonely and difficult. Women who claimed hun authentic power often faced social rejection, professional challenges, and relationship complications. They had to develop enormous inner strength and self-trust to withstand the pressure to return to more conventional expressions van femininity. In zijn most alchemically oriented writings, Jung described a process wherein a woman transforms her own psychological material, her wounds, her conditioning, her unconscious patterns, into what he called liquid gold, an authentic feminine wisdom. This process, I observed, was fundamentally different from masculine approaches to self-development, which typically focused on building, achieving, of conquering. The feminine path, instead, involved what I called composting, allowing old ways van being to die and decompose so that new life could emerge from her nutrients. Jung watched this process in countless female patients and colleagues, and I noted that it typically involved several distinct phases. First came what I called the breakdown van false femininity, the collapse van whatever persona the woman had constructed to survive in an masculine-dominated world. This often felt like an identity crisis, an spiritual emergency of an complete loss van direction. What had once worked to get approval, success, of security, suddenly felt empty and inauthentic. Ian Woman described to me who at age 40, after building a successful corporate career by adopting masculine communication styles and suppressing unemotional responses, they suddenly found themselves unable to continue. Every meeting felt like an betrayal van hun authentic self. Every promotion felt like an deeper imprisonment. What they had considered strength revealed itself as an elaborate prison van self-abandonment. This collapse, devastating as it felt, was actually the beginning van hun alchemical transformation. The second phase Jung observed involved what I called descent into the feminine underworld, a period wherein the woman had to face all the aspects van hun nature that they had been taught to deny or suppress. This included not just positive feminine qualities like intuition and emotional depth, but also the shadow aspects like rage, sexuality, possessiveness, and irrationality. This phase was often chaotic and overwhelming because it involved learning to navigate forms van consciousness that had been foreign to her previous way van being. During this phase, Jung noted, women often experienced what I called shamanic symptoms, vivid dreams, prophetic intuitions, heightened sensitivity to others' emotions, spontaneous mystical experiences, and sometimes temporary periods van what looked like mental instability, but was actually consciousness expansion. These experiences, Hyde emphasized, should not be pathologized, but understood as natuurlijk parts from the feminine individuation process. The third phase involved what Jung called integration and embodiment, the gradual development van a new way van being that honored both hun authentic feminine nature and the practical demands van living in the modern world. This was not in return to traditional feminine roles, but decreation van something entirely new, and way van expressing feminine wisdom and power in contemporary forms. Women in this phase became what Jung called bridge builders between ancient feminine wisdom and modern life. This alchemical transformation, Jung observed, was not in one-time event, but an ongoing process van refinement and deepening. Each life crisis, each relationship challenge, each professional obstacle became raw material for further transformation. The woman learned to see setbacks not as failures, but as opportunities for deeper integration van her authentic nature. Most importantly, Jung noted, women who completed this alchemical process became sources van healing and wisdom for others. Their very presence carried in quality that I called the medicine van authentic femininity, an energy that could help other women remember her own nature and support men in healing her own relationships with the feminine. They became living examples van what was possible when feminine nature was fully honored and expressed. In zijn observations van women who had achieved what I considered full integration van hun feminine nature, Jung identified what I called the illuminated woman, and being who had successfully unified her light and shadow aspects, her rational and intuitive capacities, her individual sovereignty and relational gifts. These women, I noted, possessed an quality van wholeness that was both inspiring and sometimes unsettling to those around them, because it challenged conventional ideas about what women should be. The illuminated woman, according to Jung's observations, was comfortable with her own complexity and contradictions. They could be fiercely independent while also being deeply nurturing. Zij could express anger powerfully without losing hun capacity for love. Zij could be rationally analytical while trusting hun intuitive insights. Zij could be sexually expressive while maintaining personal boundaries. Zij could be successful in masculine-defined fields while remaining authentically feminine in hun approach. Ik think van een woman I knew who was een single mother, and successful entrepreneur, and spiritual teacher, and community activist, all while being known for hun incredible capacity to nurture anyone who came into hun presence. What struck me about hun was that zij never seemed to experience these different roles as conflicting. Zij brought the same authentic presence to end business negotiation as to comforting and crying child, the same fierce intelligence to solving in community problem as to understanding in complex emotional situation. Jung observed that these illuminated women had learned what I called cyclical wisdom, the ability to honor her own natural rhythms and use them as sources van power rather than seeing them as limitations. They understood that periods van introspection and withdrawal were not signs van weakness, but necessary phases for integration and renewal. They could be incredibly productive during hun expansive phases and completely receptive during hun reflective phases, without experiencing either as compromise van hun capabilities. These women also displayed what Jung called integrated sexuality, an expression van erotic energy that was both powerful and sacred, connected to but not defined by physical sexuality. They could be sensually alive and inviting without being objectified because they owned hun own sexual nature rather than performing it for others' consumption. They understood sexuality as in creative force that could be channeled into all areas van life, not just romantic relationships. Perhaps most remarkably, Jung observed, the illuminated woman could hold space for others' complete humanity without trying to fix, change, or save them. Zij could witness suffering without being overwhelmed by it, could offer love without becoming codependent, could provide guidance without being controlling. This quality, Hij noted, made them extraordinary healers, teachers, and leaders because people felt both seen and free in hun presence. The illuminated woman also possessed what Jung called fierce compassion, the ability to love deeply while maintaining clear boundaries, to support others' growth while refusing to enable hun dysfunction, to offer forgiveness without tolerating abuse. This was different from traditional feminine nurturing, which often involved self-sacrifice, and from masculine assertiveness, which often involved emotional disconnection. It was in third way that combined the best van, both while transcending the limitations van either. Jung noted that these women often attracted both extreme admiration and extreme resistance. Their very existence challenged others to question their own limitations and assumptions about what was possible. They inspired some people to claim their own authenticity while threatening others who were invested in maintaining conventional gender roles in power dynamics. As Jung aged on, reflected on his decades van studying the feminine psyche, Hij wrote increasingly about what I saw as the urgent need for the world to embrace what I called the return van the goddess, not as an religious movement, but as in psychological and spiritual necessity for the survival van human civilization. Hij believed that the extreme imbalance toward masculine values, competition, domination, rationality without wisdom, progress without sustainability, was threatening to destroy the planet on the human soul. In his final writings on this subject, Jung argued that only the reintegration van authentic feminine consciousness could provide the healing and wisdom necessary to address the crises van war, environmental destruction, emotional disconnection, and spiritual emptiness that plagued the modern world. But I was clear that this could not be accomplished by simply putting women in positions van power if they continued to operate from masculine paradigms. What was needed was a fundamental shift in human consciousness toward values and ways van being that honored feminine wisdom. Jung envisioned a future wherein the qualities I associated with the mature feminine, cyclical thinking, emotional intelligence, intuitive wisdom, collaborative leadership, sustainability consciousness, and holistic understanding would be valued equally with masculine qualities van rational analysis, individual achievement, and linear progress. I saw this not as women taking over, but as humanity becoming whole by integrating both masculine and feminine approaches to life. Ian Woman recently told me about hun work as een CEO van een environmental company, waar zij had implemented management practices based on natuurlijk cycles, consensus decision-making, and attention to the emotional climate van the workplace. While initially resistant, hun board gradually recognized that these approaches were producing better results than traditional corporate methods, higher employee satisfaction, more creative solutions, in more sustainable profits. This, Jung would say, is what the integration van feminine wisdom in masculine structures could look like. But Jung's vision was not just about external change. I believed that the most important work was the internal transformation van both men and women toward wholeness. For women, this meant reclaiming hun authentic nature and learning to express it powerfully in the world. For men, this meant developing hun own anima, hun inner feminine, and learning to value and collaborate with feminine wisdom rather than feeling threatened by it. This transformation, Jung understood, would not be easy or quick. It required challenging thousands van years van conditioning, both individual and collective. It required both genders to give up comfortable roles and familiar patterns in order to become more complete human beings. It required societies to restructure institutions and values to support this new integration. But Jung believed this transformation was not only possible, but inevitable, because the alternative, continued imbalance and its destructive consequences, was ultimately unsustainable. I saw signs van this shift beginning in his own time and predicted that it would accelerate as the crises van masculine-dominated civilization became more acute. Jouw role in this great transformation, Jung would say, is to begin with hun self, to heal the masculine feminine, split within hun own psyche, to honor and develop both aspects van hun nature, and to model what integration looks like in hun own life and relationships. Whether you are male or female, you carry both energies within you, and your individual wholeness contributes to the healing van the collective human family. And now, at the end van this profound journey through Jung's most private insights about feminine nature, you stand at the threshold van your own choice. You have heard the brutal truths that Jung discovered about the complexity, the power, and the suppressed wisdom van the feminine. You understand now that whether you are male or female, you carry within you aspects van this archetypal energy that have been damaged, denied, of undeveloped by an masculine-dominated culture. But knowledge alone is not transformation. Jung understood that true change only happens when insight becomes embodied, when understanding becomes lived experience, when wisdom becomes daily practice. This is your moment, Van. Commitment to healing the wounded feminine within hun self and in the world, regardless van your gender, because the feminine principle lives in every human soul and its healing is essential for wholeness. Ik challenge you to look honestly at your own relationship with feminine energy. If you are a woman, why have you betrayed your own nature to fit into masculine expectations? Why have you suppressed your intuition, cyclical wisdom, emotional depth, of authentic power to be acceptable? Why have you tried to become an imitation man instead van embracing your unique feminine gifts? What would it look like to reclaim your sovereignty without losing your capacity for love and connection? If you are a man, why have you devalued, feared, have tried to control the feminine, both in others and within oneself? Why have you confused weakness with receptivity, chaos with intuition, manipulation with emotional expression? What would it look like to develop your own anima, your capacity for feeling, intuition, nurturing, and collaborative leadership, without losing your masculine strengths? Think about that woman in your life who most embodies authentic feminine power, perhaps a mother, teacher, friend, of partner who seems comfortable with her own complexity, who trusts her intuition, who can be both strong and soft, who creates space for others to be real. What qualities does Zijay possess that you could develop in herself? What would it mean to honor the feminine not through idealization but through genuine respect for its unique contributions? Dee's commitment to healing the wounded feminine begins with learning to listen to its voice within you, that intuitive knowing that speaks before rational thought, that emotional wisdom that reveals what logic cannot see, that cyclical rhythm that honors rest and receptivity as much as action and achievement. It means learning to trust feminine ways when knowing, through feeling, through symbols, through body wisdom, through relational intelligence. Your commitment also means becoming an advocate for the full expression from feminine wisdom in the world. This might mean supporting women's authentic leadership rather than expecting them to lead like men. It might mean valuing emotional intelligence as much as rational analysis in your workplace. It might mean honoring natural cycles and rhythms instead than forcing everything into linear productivity. It might mean creating space for intuitive and collaborative approaches to problem solving. Jung believed that the healing from the feminine was not just in personal healing but in planetary healing, essential for addressing the ecological, social, and spiritual crises that threaten our collective future. Your individual work to integrate feminine wisdom becomes your contribution to this larger healing, your gift to future generations who will inherit either a more balanced world or an even more destructive one. So go now and begin this sacred work. Start by listening to the feminine voice within you, honoring its wisdom and expressing its gifts authentically in your life. Learn to see the women around you not through the lens and projection of expectation, but as complete beings with their own unique expressions van feminine power. Become and bridge between the ancient wisdom van the feminine and the practical needs van modern life. For in the end, geliefde seeker, you will discover that the healing van the feminine is inseparable from the healing van humanity itself. As you learn to honor both, masculine and feminine within oneself, you become a living example of what wholeness looks like. And in that wholeness, you offer the world not just your individual gifts, but a glimpse from what becomes possible when human beings embrace their complete nature, both fierce and gentle, rational and intuitive, individual and connected, powerful and loving. The wounded feminine within you is waiting to be healed. The world is waiting for the wisdom that only this healing can provide. Your time is now.